Standing in the back of the crowded banquet hall, I watched my father raise his glass and tell 200 people that his eldest son wasn't worth mentioning. He expected a laugh. Instead, he got dead silence when his billionaire CEO walked in, holding a confidential folder with my name on it. Growing up in the Bennett household, love was not something freely given. It was a highly competitive currency, and I was perpetually bankrupt. My father, Richard Bennett, was a man who measured human worth strictly in job titles, golf handicaps, and corner offices. He spent 40 years clawing his way up the middle management ladder at Vanguard Solutions, a mid-sized logistics and tech firm. He wasn't the CEO, but he demanded to be treated like one at home. My mother, Margaret, was his dedicated echo. She orchestrated our family's public image with military precision, ensuring the neighbors only ever saw a flawless, thriving suburban dynasty. The masterpiece of that dynasty was my younger brother, Caleb. Caleb was the golden child, a title he earned by simply being loud, charming, and athletically gifted. When Caleb scored a touchdown in high school, my parents threw a catered party. When I won a state-level mathematics decathlon the same year, my father casually asked if the tournament had provided free pizza because he didn't want to reimburse me for lunch. The disparity only deepened as we grew older. They co-signed a massive loan for Caleb to attend an expensive, out-of-state private university, arguing that a man with his pedigree needed the right network. For me, they offered a dusty set of luggage and a map to the local state college. "You're smart enough to figure it out, Lucas," my mother had said, casually flipping through a magazine. "Besides, we can't afford 2 tuition bills. Caleb needs the head start." I did figure it out. I worked night shifts at a server farm, took maximum credits, and lived on ramen and Spite. While Caleb was failing his business ethics classes and crashing leased sports cars that my parents quietly paid off, I was quietly building a foundation in software architecture and venture capital. By my late 20s, the family dynamic had crystallized into a permanent, toxic reality. To my parents, Caleb was a delayed genius, currently finding his footing as a low-level sales rep. I, on the other hand, was the disappointment. Because I rarely talked about my work, mostly to avoid my father's dismissive sneers, they assumed I was a struggling IT worker. Once, 5 years ago, I helped my dad reset a faulty router at his house. From that day on, he firmly categorized me as a computer repairman. I never corrected them. Silence was my armor. What they didn't know, and what I had taken great pains to keep entirely separate from my toxic family life, was that my small software startup had been acquired for a staggering sum when I was 28. I didn't buy a flashy car or a mansion. Instead, I took that capital and founded Oak and Iron Holdings, a boutique private equity firm specializing in hostile takeovers and corporate restructuring. For the past 3 years, my firm had been aggressively acquiring failing logistics companies. 2 months ago, we set our sights on Vanguard Solutions, my father's company. Vanguard was hemorrhaging money due to bloated middle management and outdated tech infrastructure. Oak and Iron bought a controlling stake, a move kept strictly confidential until the transition was ready. I was officially the shadow owner of Vanguard Solutions. My father, who still thought I crawled under desks to untangle Ethernet cables, was technically my employee. The collision course was set when my mother called me on a brisk Tuesday afternoon. "Lucas," she sighed into the receiver, sounding exhausted by my mere existence. "Your father's retirement gala is this Saturday. The Fairmont Hotel. We expect you to be there." "I have a lot of work this weekend, Mom," I replied, staring at the finalized Vanguard acquisition documents on my mahogany desk. "Don't be difficult. It's a plated dinner, and we're paying $80 a head. We already put you down. Just wear a dark suit, please, and try to get a haircut. Simon Hayes, the regional director, will be there, and your father wants the family to look presentable." "Where am I sitting?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Table 12, near the kitchen doors. Caleb is at the head table with us, obviously, since he's preparing a toast. Please don't make a scene, Lucas. Just come, eat, clap, and you can slip out early if your social anxiety acts up." "I'll be there," I said, a cold, hard knot forming in my chest. I hung up the phone and pressed the intercom button on my desk. "Sarah," I said to my assistant, "contact Harrison Sterling. Tell him I'll be attending the Vanguard retirement event in person this Saturday. Have him bring the restructuring files." Harrison Sterling was my public-facing CEO at Oak and Iron Holdings. A ruthless, brilliant corporate shark, Harrison handled the spotlight while I pulled the strings from the shadows. Vanguard's upper management knew who Harrison Sterling was. They lived in terror of him, knowing his firm had just bought them out. They had absolutely no idea, he answered to me. The Crystal Ballroom at the Fairmont Hotel was dripping in manufactured corporate opulence. Chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over 50 round tables draped in crisp white linen. Waiters in black vests circulated with trays of champagne and bacon-wrapped scallops. I arrived exactly on time, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than my father's first car. True to my mother's word, my assigned seat was at table 12, wedged tightly between the swinging kitchen doors and a loud air conditioning vent. My table mates consisted of 2 low-level shipping clerks who spent the first hour complaining about their 401k matches, and my Aunt Beatrice, who spent the evening glaring at my drink as if she expected me to spill it. Across the room, bathed in a spotlight, was the head table. My father sat at the center, radiating smug satisfaction. He wore a rented tuxedo that fit a bit too snugly around his waist. Next to him sat my mother, beaming, and Caleb, who was already loudly recounting his college fraternity days to Vanguard's regional director, Simon Hayes. I watched my father hold court. He shook hands, clapped men on the shoulders, and played the part of the conquering hero stepping down from his throne. For a man retiring from a redundant regional management position, he carried himself like a head of state. At 8:30 p.m., the clinking of silverware against glass echoed through the room. Simon Hayes stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice booming through the ballroom, "tonight, we honor 40 years of dedication. Richard Bennett is a pillar of Vanguard Solutions, a man of integrity, vision, and relentless drive." The applause was polite, standard corporate sycophancy. My father stood, buttoned his jacket, and confidently strode to the podium. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, put on his reading glasses, and surveyed his audience. "Thank you, Simon," my father said, his voice thick with unearned gravitas. 40 years. It seems like only yesterday I walked through the doors of Vanguard. I've built a legacy here. A legacy of hard work, uncompromising standards, and family values. He gestured expansively to the head table. "Speaking of family, I couldn't have done this without my beautiful wife, Margaret, and of course, my son, Caleb." Caleb stood up and gave a smarmy, 2-fingered salute to the crowd. A murmur of appreciative laughter rippled through the room. "Caleb," my father continued, his voice swelling with pride, "is a born leader. He has the Bennett drive. In fact, he's currently dominating the sales field, and I have no doubt he'll be running his own division soon. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. Caleb had been fired from his last 2 sales jobs and was currently living in my parents' finished basement. "Now," my father paused, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth, "some of you know I actually have 2 sons." A few heads turned. The room grew slightly quieter. "My oldest, Lucas, is here tonight as well. Somewhere in the back, I believe." He shielded his eyes from the spotlight, squinting toward the kitchen doors. He didn't actually spot me. He just gestured vaguely to the darkness. "Lucas is our resident computer guy. If your Wi-Fi router breaks, he's your man." Honestly, in a room full of esteemed corporate strategists and visionaries, his daily routine is, well, it's not really worth mentioning. The silence in the room was palpable. A few uncomfortable chuckles broke out near the front, mostly from executives desperate to appease the man of the hour. Aunt Beatrice audibly sighed next to me. It was a classic Richard Bennett move, elevate himself by stepping on my neck. He didn't just want to be celebrated. He wanted a contrast. He needed a failure to highlight his own perceived success. I didn't flinch. I didn't look down. I just kept my eyes locked on the podium, waiting. "But enough about IT support," my father chuckled, leaning closer to the microphone. "Tonight is about the future of Vanguard." He was interrupted by a heavy, resounding thud. The massive oak doors at the main entrance of the ballroom didn't just open, they were pushed wide with aggressive authority. The low hum of the room instantly died. Standing in the entryway, flanked by two sharp-suited legal aides, was Harrison Sterling. Sterling was an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, radiating the kind of absolute power that makes lesser men unconsciously hold their breath. As the CEO of Oak and Iron Holdings, his face had been splashed across the cover of the Wall Street Journal twice that year. Every single executive in the room, including Simon Hayes, recognized him instantly. They knew Oak and Iron had just acquired their company. They knew heads were about to roll. Panic immediately washed over the front tables. Simon Hayes went visibly pale. My father, however, completely misread the room. Blinded by his own ego, he assumed this monumental arrival was a testament to his own importance. He gripped the edges of the podium, his chest puffing out. "Mr. Sterling," my father boomed into the microphone, his voice dripping with syrupy awe. "What an absolute, unexpected honor. Ladies and gentlemen, the CEO of our new parent company has graced my retirement gala." Sterling didn't even look at the podium. He strode purposefully down the center aisle, the heavy carpet absorbing his footsteps. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. He carried a thick, leather-bound folder under his left arm. His eyes scanned the darkened tables near the back of the room. "Mr. Sterling, please," my father called out, stepping away from the microphone and gesturing toward the empty chair next to Caleb. "We have a seat for you right here at the head table. Let me get you a drink." Sterling completely ignored him. He walked straight past the head table, past the sweating regional director, and marched directly toward the kitchen doors. He stopped precisely at table 12. The two shipping clerks next to me froze, terrified. Aunt Beatrice dropped her fork. Sterling turned his gaze entirely onto me. The intimidating, shark-like demeanor vanished, replaced instantly by profound professional deference. He gave a sharp, respectful nod. "Mr. Bennett," Sterling said, his deep voice carrying clearly in the dead-silent room. "I apologize for interrupting the festivities, but the Vanguard restructuring mandates require your immediate authorization before the market opens on Monday." Up at the podium, my father let out a confused, nervous laugh. "Mr. Sterling, I think you're confused. That's my son, Lucas. He fixes computers. I'm Richard Bennett." Sterling slowly turned around. He looked at my father as if he had just noticed a smudge of dirt on a white wall. "I know exactly who you are, Richard," Sterling said, his tone icy. "You are a redundant regional manager whose severance package I drafted this morning." Sterling turned his back on my father and faced me again, holding out the heavy leather folder with both hands, offering it like a king handing over a crown. "Sir," Sterling said to me, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, "the executive liquidation files are ready. The board is awaiting your final signature to initiate the purge." The silence in the crystal ballroom was so absolute, you could hear the low, mechanical hum of the air conditioning unit directly above table 12. Every single eye in the room darted frantically between my father, who was frozen behind the microphone, and the heavy leather folder suspended in Harrison Sterling's outstretched hands. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. My father's face went through a fascinating spectrum of colors, from a boastful crimson to a sickly, ashen gray. He adjusted his rented tuxedo jacket, his brain desperately trying to process a reality that fundamentally contradicted his entire worldview. "Mr. Sterling," my father finally stammered, his voice entirely stripped of its former booming confidence. He stepped down from the podium and began power walking down the center aisle toward us. "There has been a monumental clerical error. You are handing highly classified restructuring documents to my son. He's an IT technician. He works on servers." Harrison Sterling didn't flinch. He didn't even turn his head to acknowledge the man approaching him. He kept his steely gaze fixed entirely on me, waiting for my cue. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, I reached out and took the leather folder from Sterling's hands. The weight of it felt incredibly satisfying. I set it down on the cheap white tablecloth, right next to Aunt Beatrice's half-eaten bread roll. "Thank you, Harrison," I said, my voice calm, projecting just enough to carry in the dead-silent room. Were there any complications with the SEC filings this afternoon? None, sir, Sterling replied, folding his hands behind his back. The acquisition of Vanguard Solutions by Oak and Iron Holdings was fully finalized at 4 p.m. Eastern. You are now the majority shareholder and acting chairman of the board. A collective gasp rippled through the front tables. Simon Hayes, the regional director who had just introduced my father, dropped his champagne flute. It shattered against the parquet floor, the sound exploding like a gunshot in the quiet room. My father reached table 12, panting slightly, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. He looked at me, then at Sterling, his eyes wild with disbelief. "Lucas!" my father hissed, trying to keep his voice low, though the acoustics of the ballroom betrayed him. "What kind of sick, elaborate prank is this? Did you hire an actor? Because if you're trying to ruin my retirement—" "Mr. Bennett," Sterling interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, radiating pure corporate menace. "You will address the chairman with the respect his position demands, or I will have security escort you out of your own dinner." My mother, Margaret, had finally managed to unglue herself from her chair at the head table. She hurried over, her heels clicking rapidly, her perfectly manicured facade cracking. Caleb trailed right behind her, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. "Lucas, honey, what is going on?" my mother pleaded, her hands fluttering nervously. "Why is this man calling you the chairman? You told us you worked in computer repair." "I never told you I worked in computer repair, Mom," I replied, unbuttoning my suit jacket and taking a seat at the table. I flipped open the heavy leather folder. 5 years ago, I fixed a router for Dad. You both decided that was the ceiling of my potential, and I simply never bothered to correct you. It was quieter that way. I pulled a silver Mont Blanc pen from my inside pocket. The documents inside the folder were neatly organized, flagged with red "Sign Here" tabs. "The truth," I continued, scanning the top document, "is that I sold my first tech startup 3 years ago for $85 million. I used that capital to found Oak and Iron Holdings. And for the last 60 days, my team has been quietly buying up Vanguard's debt and acquiring controlling shares." I looked up, locking eyes with my father. All the smug superiority he had worn like a crown for 40 years was melting off his face. "You don't own this company," my father whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "Vanguard is a $200 million logistics firm. You are just Lucas." "I am Oak and Iron," I corrected him flatly, "and as of 4 hours ago, I own 68% of Vanguard, which means, Richard, you don't work for Vanguard anymore. You work for me." Caleb, trying to salvage his golden boy image, puffed out his chest and stepped forward. "Look, bro, this is a cool flex and all, but Dad is retiring tonight with a full pension and his executive stock options. You can't just come in here and mess with his golden parachute. He's earned it." I couldn't help but smile. It was a cold, humorless smile. "Ah, yes. The retirement package," I murmured, turning to the second page in the folder. "Harrison, would you care to brief my former family on the findings of our due diligence phase?" Sterling nodded sharply, turning to face my father, my mother, and my brother. During the auditing process of Vanguard's regional accounts over the past month, Oak and Iron's forensic accountants uncovered a series of severe financial discrepancies. Specifically, in the vendor contracts authorized by the outgoing regional manager, Richard Bennett. My father's knees actually buckled. He had to grab the back of Aunt Beatrice's chair to steady himself. Aunt Beatrice, for her part, looked absolutely thrilled by the drama, her eyes wide as saucers. "What discrepancies?" my mother asked, her voice shrill. "Richard has been a loyal employee for 40 years. He is a pillar of this community." "He is a fraud, Margaret," I said softly, my eyes fixed on Caleb. "And he's been funding his favorite son's failures with company money." Standing up from the table, I picked up the folder and bypassed my stunned family. I walked purposefully down the center aisle toward the spotlight and the empty podium. The crowd parted for me, executives practically shrinking into their chairs to avoid my gaze. I reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out over the sea of terrified Vanguard employees. My father, mother, and Caleb were left standing near the kitchen doors, looking incredibly small. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing through the ballroom. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lucas Bennett. Until about 10 minutes ago, I was not worth mentioning. As of this evening, I am the chairman of the board." I opened the folder on the podium. "Vanguard Solutions has been hemorrhaging capital for 3 years," I announced, looking directly at the executive tables. "Your tech infrastructure is a decade out of date, your supply chains are bloated, and your middle management has treated this company like a personal piggy bank. That ends tonight." I pulled out a specific financial printout, holding it up under the spotlight. "Let's talk about legacy," I said, echoing my father's earlier speech. My father stood up here and praised my brother, Caleb. He mentioned Caleb was dominating the sales field. What he failed to mention is that Caleb's company, Apex Logistics Solutions, is a shell corporation registered to a P.O. box in Delaware. A horrified murmur swept through the room. Simon Hayes buried his face in his hands. "Over the past 24 months," I continued, my voice ringing with cold authority, "Richard Bennett used his regional clearance to authorize $450,000 in phantom vendor contracts to Apex Logistics Solutions, next D4. He embezzled nearly $500,000 of Vanguard's operating budget to fund my brother's leased sports cars, his designer clothes, and his entirely fabricated career." Caleb turned completely white. He looked desperately at our mother, who was staring at my father with a look of utter, devastating betrayal. She had cared about the country club image above all else, and my father had just detonated it in front of the entire corporate ladder. "That's a lie," my father shouted from the back of the room, his voice cracking violently. "I was protecting my family. I was building a future. You were committing felony corporate fraud," I shot back, my tone leaving zero room for debate. "And you did it with an astonishing lack of sophistication." The paper trail was so obvious my first-year analysts found it on day 2 of the audit. I looked down at the documents, uncapping my silver pen. Because of these findings, I announced to the breathless room, Richard Bennett is not retiring tonight. He is being terminated, effective immediately, for gross misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. I signed the termination paper with a flourish. The scratch of the pen against the thick parchment was picked up by the microphone, a sound like a guillotine dropping. "Consequently," I added, looking back at my father, "all executive stock options, unvested pensions, and severance packages are entirely null and void. The golden parachute has been cut." "You can't do this!" my mother shrieked, tears finally streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She rushed down the aisle toward the podium. "Lucas, please! He is your father! We are your family. You can't leave us with nothing." I looked down at the woman who had spent 30 years making me feel like an unwelcome guest in my own home. I felt no anger, no sadness, just a profound, liberating emptiness. "You left me with nothing a long time ago, Mom," I said quietly, though the microphone carried it to the farthest corners of the room. "You invested everything into Caleb. Now, you can reap the dividends." I turned my attention to Simon Hayes, who jumped in his seat as if I had tasered him. "Mr. Hayes," I said sharply. "Yes, Mr. Bennett," Simon stammered, standing up so fast he knocked over a water glass. "My team will be in the corporate offices at 7 a.m. on Monday," I instructed. "I expect full cooperation. Furthermore, Oak and Iron's legal department will be forwarding the evidence of Richard Bennett's embezzlement to the district attorney's office on Tuesday morning. Vanguard will be pressing full criminal charges." My father let out a strangled, breathless sound and collapsed into an empty chair at table 12, clutching his chest. Caleb didn't rush to help him. Caleb was already backing toward the exit doors, frantically pulling out his cell phone, likely trying to figure out how to liquidate his bank accounts before they were frozen. I closed the leather folder. The satisfying thud echoed one last time. "The bar is now fully open, courtesy of Oak and Iron Holdings," I told the crowd. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, ladies and gentlemen. The real work begins on Monday." I stepped down from the podium. I didn't walk back down the center aisle. I didn't look back at my father, who was now weeping openly at the table where he had planned to hide me. I simply handed the signed folder back to Harrison Sterling, who was waiting near the side exit. "Excellent work, sir," Sterling murmured, securing the documents. "Your car is waiting in the alley." "Let's go, Harrison," I said, adjusting my cuffs. I've had enough of family gatherings for one lifetime. The weekend that followed the retirement gala was an exercise in digital bombardment. My personal cell phone, a number I had foolishly forgotten to change, practically melted from the influx of calls and texts. My mother left 14 voicemails. The first few were hysterical, demanding I call her back and fix the misunderstanding. By Sunday afternoon, the tone had shifted to vicious, desperate anger, accusing me of destroying the family out of petty, childhood jealousy. I didn't listen to most of them. I simply forwarded the audio files to Oak and Iron's legal department to add to the harassment file, just in case they tried to escalate things physically. Aunt Beatrice, acting as the family's unofficial town crier, had apparently spent her Sunday calling every distant cousin and extended relative on the eastern seaboard. Half the family thought I was a monster. The other half were suddenly very interested in asking me for loans. I blocked them all. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, biting chill in the air. At exactly 6:45 a.m., a fleet of black SUVs pulled into the Vanguard Solutions executive parking lot. Harrison Sterling and I stepped out, flanked by a team of 6 forensic accountants, 4 corporate attorneys, and a private security detail. The atmosphere inside the Vanguard headquarters was downright suffocating. Word of what had happened at the Fairmont Hotel had spread through the company grapevine with terrifying speed. As we walked through the glass-walled lobby, employees stopped dead in their tracks, holding their coffees like shields, staring wide-eyed at the new regime. We didn't head to my father's old desk in the middle management wing. We took the private elevator straight to the top floor, where the C-suite resided. Simon Hayes was already packing his office into a cardboard box when we pushed through his double doors. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. His tie was askew, and his hands trembled as he placed a framed photo of his golden retriever into the box. "Mr. Bennett," Simon croaked, swallowing hard. "Mr. Sterling, I drafted my resignation letter yesterday. It's on the desk." "Resignation denied, Simon," I said, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "You don't get to quietly resign and keep your stock options after looking the other way while my father bled this company dry." "I didn't know the extent of it," Simon pleaded, stepping out from behind his mahogany desk. "Richard was a senior manager. He handled the Delaware accounts independently. I just signed off on the macro budgets." Sterling stepped forward, placing a thick stack of printed emails on the desk. "You were CC'd on 14 separate vendor approvals for Apex Logistics Solutions, Mr. Hayes," Sterling said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "You also accepted a golf club membership paid for by that same vendor. You are complicit. You are being terminated for cause, and we will be providing these emails to the district attorney." Simon slumped into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands. By noon, the entire C-suite had been cleared out. We fired the chief financial officer, the head of logistics, and 3 regional managers who had been riding my father's coattails. The rot went deep, but Oak and Iron specialized in amputation. The real climax of the ordeal, however, didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened 3 weeks later in a sterile conference room at the district attorney's office. My father's embezzlement was too large and too blatantly documented to sweep under the rug, and the Vanguard board, now completely controlled by my firm, demanded blood. The state had formally charged Richard Bennett with multiple counts of wire fraud and grand larceny. We were seated on one side of a long, scratched wooden table, myself, Harrison Sterling, and the lead prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah Jenkins. The door clicked open, and my father walked in, accompanied by a public defender. He looked entirely broken. The robust, booming patriarch who had demanded absolute obedience was gone. In his place was a frail, stooped old man in a cheap, off-the-rack suit that hung loosely off his suddenly diminished frame. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Behind him walked Caleb. My golden child brother hadn't come to support our father. He had come to save his own skin. When the DA's office realized Caleb was the sole proprietor of the shell company receiving the stolen funds, they had threatened him with accomplice charges. Predictably, Caleb folded like a cheap lawn chair. "Let's get this over with," Prosecutor Jenkins sighed, opening her file. "Mr. Bennett Richard, we have your son Caleb's sworn testimony. He has officially stated that he had no knowledge the funds funneling into his Delaware LLC were stolen from Vanguard. He claims you set up the account, managed the transfers, and told him it was an early inheritance from your personal investments." My father finally looked up, staring at Caleb with a mixture of shock and utter heartbreak. "Caleb, you told them that?" Caleb shifted uncomfortably in his seat, refusing to make eye contact with the man who had ruined his own life to fund Caleb's delusions. "Look, Dad, I can't go to jail. I have a whole life ahead of me. You told me the money was clean. I'm just telling them the truth." It was a lie, of course. Caleb knew exactly where the money was coming from. But watching my father realize that his favored son was eagerly tossing him under the bus to avoid a felony conviction was the only justice I needed. Given the testimony and the overwhelming paper trail, Jenkins continued, ignoring the family drama, "The state is offering a plea deal. Richard, you will plead guilty to 1 count of felony grand larceny. In exchange for avoiding a 5-year prison sentence, you will accept 10 years of strict probation, and you will pay full restitution to Vanguard Solutions. The amount is $450,000. "I don't have that kind of money," my father whispered, his voice cracking. "My pension is gone. My stock is voided." "Then you will have to liquidate your assets," Sterling interjected smoothly, not missing a beat, "starting with your primary residence." My father's head snapped toward me, tears welling in his eyes. For the first time in my 30 years of life, he looked at me not as an underling, not as a disappointment, but as an equal. Actually, no. He looked at me as his superior. "Lucas, please," he begged, his voice trembling. "The house. Your mother loves that house. We've lived there for 30 years. If we sell it, we'll have nothing left. We'll be on the street. Please, you're the chairman. You can drop the restitution demand. You can make this go away." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. I looked at the man who had mocked my ambitions, who had refused to pay for my college lunch, who had stood in front of 200 people and declared my life not worth mentioning. "I could," I said softly, the silence in the room hanging heavy, "but I won't." "I am your father," he cried out, a desperate, final grasp at the authority he used to wield. "You were a biological necessity, Richard," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "But you were never a father to me. You made your bed with Caleb. Now, you both have to lie in it." I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket. "Sign the plea deal, Richard. Sell the house. Because if you drag this to trial, my lawyers will ensure you spend the rest of your twilight years in a federal penitentiary." I didn't wait for his response. I walked out of the conference room, leaving my family to the ruins of the empire they thought they possessed. 6 months later, the dust finally settled. Vanguard Solutions, under the ruthless but efficient management of Oak and Iron, turned its first profit in over 4 years. We streamlined the logistics software, cut the dead weight from middle management, and secured 2 massive government shipping contracts. My net worth climbed by another 20%. As for the Bennett family, reality hit them with the force of a freight train. They sold the suburban house to cover the massive restitution debt. Without my father's stolen income, Caleb was forced to actually work. The last I heard through the grapevine, the born leader who was supposed to run his own division was currently working the night shift at a regional call center, selling extended car warranties. My parents moved into a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. My mother, who had spent decades playing the role of the pristine country club wife, had to take a job as a part-time receptionist at a dental clinic just to help cover their basic groceries and my father's probation fees. I never spoke to any of them again. Sometimes, when I'm sitting in my corner office, looking out over the sprawling city skyline, I think back to that retirement gala. I think about the sneer on my father's face, the laughter of the crowd, the utter certainty they had that I was nothing but a footnote in their grand suburban narrative. They were right about one thing, though. The life I used to live in their shadow truly wasn't worth mentioning. But the life I built from the ashes of their neglect, that one speaks for itself.